All right, so we are continuing in this series looking at I want to believe but. And as we've been looking at so far, this is week number 4. And we've been looking at this idea that people come in with distorted views of who God is, and that distorted view of who God is really leads them to their whole picture of theology. And so it was with this idea of science. And here's what I'll say right at the front before we even get into this is I love science. Like, science is great. I mean, it was one of the subjects I loved in high school. I ended up taking, multiple, biology, AP biology, physics, and all this other. It's good stuff. Like, science is good. But here's the problem. About 100 years ago, maybe a little more, 1896, there was a scientist who wrote a book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. So that's almost like saying shots fired, because this is the first time in the history of the world that somebody was saying warfare. Why do we have to create war where there isn't? But we'll get to that here in a little bit. So this is the dominant thoughts of the day, is that Christianity and science are adversaries, they're enemies. Like, they're always going to be at war with one another. Science, religion, God, that whole thing is like, we've got to be in two different realms. You're either going to be a theologian and talk about the things of God, or you're going to be in science, because here's the thing. You can be scientific and rational or religious. This is a quote from Dawkins, who is a predominant atheist writer. And he is a scientist, but I think that he also works more in his realm of trying to be able to destroy, I would say, Christendom, Christianity, destroy the idea of that there is no God. So he says you can be scientific or rational, or you can be religious, meaning, like, if you're religious, you're not scientific or rational. Why is this? It says the Bible denies evolution, which most educated people in the world today believe in evolution. So there's that thought, right? So you get these things and you're saying, all right, so if evolution is the way, then it automatically denies God's existence. That's what the thought is out there. I'm going to talk to you. This isn't actually real, but what they turned evolution into is this idea that it's all-encompassing theory explaining everything we believe, feel, and do. And when you turn something into not just science, studying the natural world, but you turn it into a whole belief system, this is no longer just science. This is also philosophy. Philosophy is the thoughts about life. What are the things that control us? What is it that controls our feelings, our emotions? What does it even control the things that I'm going to do? And they say evolution controls that all. Because there's things in you already that are directing the way of what you're going to do. But this is where the problem comes in, is that if you believe in evolution as a biological mechanism, meaning this is the way that the world is stitched together, this is the way that we can see how the world is working, that's the whole biological part, the science piece that you can look, you can test, you can understand all the physical realm. But they've also said, but if you believe in the biological, then you also have to believe in the philosophical naturalism. And so what we have today are people who, as some scientists would also categorize themselves as humanists or naturalists. And that word is simply kind of understood as I'm embracing not only the biological, but the philosophical. See, what happens here, and this is what happens in pretty much every single argument and debate, is that we're trying to create conflict. We're trying to create sides. And even though that 1896 book even has been declared as kind of really bad science history, it was like saying, here's the shot, and the shot's been fired. We are now creating two sides. You're either this or you're this. And if you find yourself trying to go between or trying to embrace the both of them, right, this is where the both sides are going to hammer you. Because it was beneficial to create conflict and create sides. We've talked about this idea of dualism. The idea of dualism says that we always have to have two. There's never any gray. There's only black and white. Dualism leads us to create more conflict than ever even is possible. This is the reason why when you're looking at some atheists who are saying you have to believe in all of it or you believe in none of it. There's people who are saying this is the reason why if you actually want to think rationally, if you want things to make sense, then you've got to embrace this biological and philosophical idea of evolution. You see, there's the conflict that arises. There's the reasons why this is causing dispute. And there's people out there who are even, apologists, as we call them, Christian apologists, who are also scientists. And they're out there and they're saying, hey, there was one guy in particular, he was going to a very Ivy League, we'll just say, he was going to Harvard. And Harvard was going to have this conversation, and this was originally how it was proposed. They were going to have a conversation with somebody who was a scientist, who was also a believer in God. And they were going to have this discussion with somebody who was an atheist, not a believer in God, but also a scientist. So the apologist went in there thinking, oh, this is going to be a conversation. But then they found out. There were pamphlets put up to be able to publicize the event. And the event was called Science versus Christianity. You see, this isn't a discussion anymore. This is an argument. This is me trying to be able to win points for my side. Instead of bringing us to the table to have a discussion about the things that are happening in the natural known world versus what the things of God, the things that are unseen, what do? We create more argument. We just create a side that's going to win and a side that's going to lose. Instead of being able to say, we need to have a discussion. Because here's the thing, what we find in these debates, no one really changes their mind. It's the same thing when you talk about the areas in which you are most passionate about and you're entering into a discussion with somebody who's sitting on the other side. Do you plan for them to change your mind? No. We're not here to be able to change people's minds about it, but we are here to fight about it. We're here to be able to show the other person how passionate we are about it. And all it does is create more argument, more fights, more division, more dissension, leaving no one to be better for it. So here's the facts. Here's the truth. There is no conflict. Now, what you're probably thinking, like, oh, but I've heard the conflicts, I've seen the conflicts. No, but here is the fact, is that there is no conflict between science and God, science and religion. I just give you a couple of people throughout history, people that you would know that are very famous scientists. Kepler, Johannes Kepler, right? He was an astronomer. He looked at the stars. He studied the universe. He was very brilliant. And yet this is part of what he also believed. He said, I was going to become a theologian. I was going to become a theologian, but here's what he said. He said, but the more I studied, the more I found is that God is glorified in astronomy. The stars, the universe, the planets, all of it is a way in which God is glorified. Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was another famous scientist. And what he looked at in all of the complexities of science and religion, he looked at this and he said, all of what I can come up with, all of the ways in which I'm trying to see all around this whole history, is that God is a God of order and not confusion. What does that mean? He looked at the numbers. He was seeing the way in which he was studying, and he says, this is what I conclude, is that God is actually ordering much of the things that we see and study. Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur, he was another famous scientist, and he also said he was going through his study, and he said, the more I study, and the more I study nature, right, the more I'm studying biology, the more that I'm studying reaction, he said, I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. You see, there is not a conflict, but these very brilliant scientists throughout time and throughout history have not come to the conclusion of being able to say, oh, well, I can't figure out a way to understand my science and my theology. No, they understood it. They said, no, this actually is very helpful for me. To understand God being the Creator and also seeing the ways in which I can understand the movement of the world. Science might not be able to account for everything about human existence. And that's really what it comes down to a lot of the times, is that many things will then, and when we talk about theories, even in science, they're creating theories. They're saying, I think this is the way that the world is running. And then how do they do a theory? They work through it, they test it, they find all of the empirical evidence, and they say, oh, it starts to match up. It starts to align. Things are good. Science makes sense, and so does God. But there's also the pieces where science still has a question about. Now, sometimes what people have done over time, and people like Darwin, who was kind of the father of the evolutionary theory, is that he would even say that God must be in the gaps. So we can have all this study, we can go through it, test the empirical evidence, we can test and study and learn from what it is that is happening in evolution. But he said there are some things that are unexplainable. And he's like, that's where God is. So that's the hard part, right? We're saying, but hold on, Darwin, wait 1 second, though. Because if God is just the God of the gaps, then is God really present all the time? What we would say and what we would look at in science and in the understanding of the things that we can see in the natural world, the known world, the physical world, is that God's present everywhere. And we don't have to simply be able to just reject all of the things that we're like, well, that doesn't make sense, so I'll just reject it. No, we can say God has put these things here for us to study, for us to learn, for us to grow. God's not just a God of the gaps, but God is present in all of it. Here's a quote by a current scientist, evolutionary ecologist. He's at the University of Wisconsin. And he says, I'm a better scientist because I am a Christian, but equally that I'm a better Christian because I'm a scientist. The reasons, truth and humility. Humility enables me to embrace rather than reject mystery. Humility reminds me that I don't have all the answers, and that even some that I do are probably wrong. I loved this quote because this is the part that actually really gets me jazzed about science and understanding the world. Is that I too love to embrace mystery. I spent a lot of time early on when I became a pastor, working at the seminary, going through study, learning and trying to understand this whole balance of science and religion. I, early on, thought that there was a battle, a war that was going on between the two. I was trying to be able to come up with how are we going to understand the world, and then how are we going to understand everything else? How do we understand God in the midst of it? And what I found through lots of study is I don't know. There's a lot of mystery in the universe. There's a lot of theories that come up, like wormhole theories and multiverse theories. I mean, these aren't just Marvel Universe kind of stuff. This is things that are actually being discussed in science. And we don't have to be afraid or worried. We don't have to be able to say, oh, well, that doesn't jive with my understanding of theology. But we say, what are we talking about? Oh, we're talking about mystery. I love mystery. Let's not try to be able to crack the code all the time, but to be able to say, God, help me to embrace the mysteries of the universe. To know that you already are actively involved in all of it. You know how you piece together the whole creation. That's why I picked that Job verse for us to read. That whole chapter in Job, that what happens with Job is that in the midst of Job's suffering, Job's he's silent for a while. He's grieving for a while. His friends blame him. They tell him to repent. It's got to be something that Job did wrong. But Job finally then starts to complain a little bit. Why? Why did this happen? Why is this going on? And this is where then, as I put in the scripture that was read earlier, this is where God finally said, hey, I'll hear your complaints. God isn't worried about us complaining to Him. God isn't worried about us bringing all of these, trying to crack mysteries. God isn't worried about that. But then what does God say? He says, were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? Were you there when I made the waters a boundary to keep it in? Were you there when I tell the moon and the sun to make its rotation? Were you there to be able to bring the light into the darkness? See, God is asking rhetorical questions. Why? Because God already knows the answer, just as much as we know the answer already too. Nobody was there, only God. And so when we are looking at this idea of religion and science, I believe that it helps to understand and to be able to explore both. That the more we actually are looking into all of the things and the wonderful stuff that science brings, we can say, oh man, look at God. This is amazing. When we look at the flowers, when we look at the grass, when we look at the way in which the world is running, we say, oh, this is beautiful. God, you are a master worker, a master creator. Let's turn to Psalm 19. Psalm 19 is a psalm of David. And this is the way that the first two verses of Psalm 19, it says, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or word. Their voice is never heard." You see, God is saying what is happening above us, what is happening in the known world. He said, this is where God is speaking. So when we are looking at the complexity of the human body, we're saying, man, God, how would this ever be random? When we're looking at the complexity of nature, and we're saying, how could this ever be random? See, God puts himself right into creation. God says, if you want to know more about me, I've given you eyes to see nature and creation. This is where we can study. This is where we can see things like evolution, and to be able to then say, hey, guess what? I embrace evolution. It's not a confession because I don't believe it's bad. I embrace evolution. Why? Because evolution helps us give us a picture of what's happening in the world and how things are going. Now, what do I reject about evolution? Is kind of the big picture of the more of the philosophical nature of evolution. I don't believe that as we see in evolution, that as it starts and as it goes, it's all dependent upon death. Have you noticed that about evolution? Death is the key for evolution. And when we say, really? So all of creation, the things that we are going through right now, I came about because of death. So there's the idea of what's called macroevolution and microevolution. Macro is that big picture, philosophical understanding of this is how we explain everything. But I believe in microevolution. That's the small changes. I believe that human beings and their bodies have changed over time in small incremental ways. I believe that has happened. Why? Because God put it in order. God put it there for us to be able to study even. God is showing himself. And we shouldn't turn away and just say, well, it doesn't make sense. But we say, God, continue to help me understand. So more of God revealing himself in creation. We turn to the New Testament. Paul writes in Romans. If you go to Romans chapter 1, 19 and 20. They know the truth about God because he's made it obvious for them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky through everything God made. They can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. So you see what happens? So God, as he is revealing himself, he's saying, I'm making it plain for everyone to see. So there isn't one who would be walking away and saying, well, God hasn't shown himself today. No, God shows himself every day. Even if you stay in your house and you don't move from there, God still shows himself in nature, in yourself, in the people around you. Now it even gets better when you walk outside and you start to be able, as we call, commune with nature. When you look at that and you're saying, I want to sit in the midst of an open field. I want to sit and walk through the forest preserves. I want to be able to see and feel the breeze and the wind in the air. Some people want to sit next to the lake or the oceans. And it's the same people who can walk away and say, God has been good. I've seen it. That right there in the midst of creation, I understand that God then speaks to me. Paul is writing this because what we would call a general revelation this is what Paul's talking about in Romans 1:19. He's saying, God is always revealed. Because here's the part that I always hear, from some predominantly atheist, kind of militant atheists, as I like to call them, is that they're always saying, well, God's been silent. God hasn't been silent. He never has and he never will. God's always speaking loudly. It's just us who like to turn off our ears, turn off our eyes, and not observe. All the signs are available. Science gives us an observation of what God has already made evident. When we look at it and study the atom, we look at it and study the cell, we look and study at the brain, and God's like, oh, I'm glad you found that one. I put that one in there just for you. God already knows. And this is what we can tell today is that the Bible is not a science book. We know that, right? It's not a science book. But it contains science. It contains the water system, and how the water, it flows through, and how it goes from rain down to the earth, and it cycles all the way back through. It's in the Bible. How the sun, rises, right? And then the moon comes up later. That whole rotation. And even though, yes, sometimes they claimed early on that the earth was flat, and some people embraced a flat earth theory, and they said, oh, well, it came from the Bible. It came from a distorted picture. That's what it came from. And then what we find is that there were some scientists who started to claim a heliocentric understanding of the world, meaning that everyone revolves around the sun. It doesn't revolve around the earth. So when we look at that, we say, oh, well, the science embraces the things that we already know. Cool. And the Bible even tells us about all of those stories, tells us of the way in which the sun moves, or that we move around the sun. See, the number is we look at the Bible not being a science book, but containing science, and we say God isn't a scientist, but he created all the scientists. And this is an article I read this week when I was looking up these things. There was a guy who's, and listen to his family dynamics. So his mom is agnostic. Agnostics are not strong, and they're just saying we don't know if there's a God. and we don't know if we'll ever know. That's what an agnostic is. Now, his mom was an agnostic, his dad was Catholic, and his brother was a Catholic priest. He was an atheist. Imagine those dinners, right? Catholic priest, Catholic father, agnostic, and an atheist. It almost sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? An agnostic and atheist walk into a bar. But sitting around, can you imagine the conversation that occurs? Well, he wrote an article which came up in my study and research on this, and he wrote, God is the creator of scientists. And this was an atheist who was writing the article. But what he recognized, and even through the dynamics of his family, is that there was something also bigger at play. He wasn't going to go all the way to say there is a God, but maybe he's more towards the agnostic than he is towards the atheist. See, God has all these things in mind because he's the creator of all things. And this is the reason why I'm going to end today talking about this Colossians verse, because the Colossians verse gives us this perspective about understanding what is happening in the midst of creation and then also bringing in Jesus, the Christ. Colossians 1:15. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him God created everything. In the heavenly realms and on earth, he made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. And listen to this. Verse 17 is a key verse. It's a tweetable verse for today. He existed before anything else, and he holds all of creation together. To me, this is the key. That we've already looked at, that yes, there are people trying to create a larger division between people. They're trying to create a division that never should exist. But as we hold to both science and theology, we say as theologians, as followers of Jesus, we know that Jesus holds all things together. It's in that place as we follow Jesus, we embrace mystery. We see all the wonderful things that God continues to do in our midst, and to be able to give God glory in all of it. In Jesus' name, amen.